Hello, and welcome to SCG Global Spin. Your host today is David Rosenzweig. David is a partner at Keegan Werlin Energy and Regulatory Practice, representing clients before state regulatory agencies, local permitting authorities, and the Massachusetts Court. Joining David is Kevin Beiter. Kevin is a partner at McGinnis Lochridge, where he represents a diverse clientele in virtually all aspects of the energy industry. Finally, we have Patrick Black. Patrick is a director at Fennemore, where he works in their Natural Resources, Energy, and Environmental Law Group, where he focuses primarily on energy regulatory matters.
Good morning, everybody. My name is David Rosenzweig. I'm from the law firm of Keegan Werlin in the Boston area. And I'm pleased to be here with my fellow panelists, Kevin and Patrick, to talk about what's hot in the energy industry. There's a lot going on in the energy and regulatory world, and much of it is driven, I think, by two principal factors. We have one, the transition from, let's say, the Trump administration to the Biden administration and what's going on in Congress on a national level. And these same issues trickle down into the local level for lots of our clients and sort of into the regional level. And I think the second is sort of a more global focus on climate change. We've seen some very aberrant weather, most recently in various parts of the country, including in the Boston area, where it was over 100 degrees in the last couple of days. And both in the short term and the long term, there's a lot of focus going on and transitioning away from fossil fuels, and at what pace that can be done, at what cost that will impose on consumers of electricity, and what its effects are on the electric and gas reliability in the long run. So, there's lots to be said here. I'm sort of interested in what Kevin and Patrick have to say on sort of the real drivers of their practice at this point, and then maybe I'll weigh in on a few things that affect my clients and my practice in the Massachusetts and New England area.
Well, would you like to start with Texas?
You bet.
Go Texas.
Yeah, it's been a tumultuous year. We've had some weather events that were really almost unprecedented. Two major ice and snow events in deep South Texas that shut down the grid in Texas for some period of time. Now, we're a little unusual in that we have ERCOT, which is a localized council that, as it turns out, has some shortcomings when you're dealing with major demand incidents. But it's causing a lot of introspection about our power mix, our power infrastructure, and sort of the industry generally. At the same time, the pandemic created some pretty significant stresses on the oil and gas, E&P, and mid-market industries in Texas. We had prior to the pandemic's emergence, a bottleneck of production in West Texas due to the lack of infrastructure leading from West Texas to refining and shipping terminals. Starting in 2018, there had been some major construction projects to build 5 large crude oil and natural gas pipelines leading from the prolific West Texas and Permian Basin of New Mexico oil and gas fields to the Texas Gulf Coast that were reaching completion right about the time the pandemic began to emerge and just cratered demand in Texas and nationwide. So we're beginning to see how we're going to dig out of that. The infrastructure is much improved, so the production is beginning to move better out of West Texas to natural gas liquefaction and refinery plants along the Texas Gulf Coast and Louisiana Gulf Coast. And so we're really at a period where exploration and production companies are having to register what their capital expenditures are going to be in relation to worldwide demand. And you see a lot of tentative movements as people try to ramp their activity back up to pre-pandemic levels. So it's an interesting time to be in the oil and gas business in Texas. Once you layer on top of that the Biden administration coming in and what is at least perceived as a significant change in prerogatives on carbon and carbon as a part of the fuel mix, we're seeing a lot more of the renewable projects, some large wind projects that started before the pandemic but are really picking up steam, and a lot more on the drawing board, and some large solar projects in West Texas. So the investment activity in renewables is also increasing, I think, monumentally here in the state. And I think that given the upset caused by the weather earlier this year, the normal seasonal demand from the extreme heat we experienced in the South and Southwest, we're going to see a lot of re-examination of how we produce our energy, where we produce our energy, and how we distribute it across the country.
Hey, Kevin, thanks. Just to give you an update of what's going on in Arizona and generally in the Southwest here. Our two largest investor-owned utilities have declared sort of clean energy proposals to go carbon-free by 2050. And certainly there's a lot of activity with large utility solar facilities that are being built in Arizona. Despite the fact that during the summertime, California utilities usually pay us to take their excess solar power. And that's one of the issues that we're dealing with here. The Arizona Corporation Commission recently promulgated their new energy rules, which would require 90%, approximately 90% carbon free by 2050, and then the remaining 10% over the last 20 years. That was done as a compromise between the Republicans and the Democrats that are on the board. It's a 5-member board, and they're statewide elected officials. The one issue, though, is I know Arizona can be get national headlines for having a little bit tumultuous politics, to say the least. But our legislature has taken the position that energy policy should be run, or at least set, by the legislature. The Corporation Commission, which is a constitutional body, they often refer to themselves as their fourth branch of government here in Arizona. They believe that it's entirely within their purview. So when the commission finalizes these final energy rules, there's some kind of conjecture that the legislature, or there may be a legal challenge to those particular rules. But despite those rules being passed or not passed, again, our investor-owned utilities have announced that they are seeking to become clean by 2050, and that would also include their interest in the Palo Verde nuclear station. So nuclear would be considered a clean technology as part of their energy mix. As you might know, Arizona is not part of a RTO or ISO. We don't have ERCOT. So there's a lot of discussions going on with transmission regional planning and trying to create more of a market, a wholesale market in the Southwest. Recently, FERC issued an order allowing the Cal ISO to basically block certain wheeling arrangements that Arizona utilities have in times of crisis. As you know, there are rolling blackouts in California, and the Cal ISO has taken it upon themselves to, I guess, protect native load. And that's caused some issues here in Arizona with respect to the idea of a longer term development of a market, especially as they're trying to integrate solar, wind, and other renewables into our generation mix for our investor-owned utilities. The same can be said with our public power Salt River project. As you know, they're like Bonneville and TVA. They're, I think, one of 3 power authorities that people might argue are the closest thing we have to a fiefdom here in the United States. But SRP certainly is on board with some of the clean power goals. And in fact, that was one of the issues that the Corporation Commission wrestled with, was whether to make these goals or whether to make them mandates. At the end of the day, the commission felt that having mandates in place would create the incentives to have the utilities meet the clean power goals here in the state, in the Southwest. Again, one of our big issues is how we're going to integrate the Southwest and the West. When you have CalISO and ERCOT on both sides, how are we going to develop some kind of regional transmission organization? And right now, the only other option would be either creating one or joining the Southwest Power Pool. And because of governance issues and costs, certainly those have not been pursued at this time. So just generally, and then I'll jump in with any other specifics.
In Massachusetts, we're part of the ISO New England power grid. There is a regional transmission organization, ISO New England, that oversees and governs the operation and reliability of the electric grid in New England. And in Massachusetts is a big part of that. It's probably half of the overall New England load. We get a lot of our power, particularly renewable power, from Canada through transmission lines, from Hydro-Quebec and from Ontario. And as I look forward, I look ahead, the transmission system is going to be a key to meeting the region's renewable energy goals that are very aggressive in this area. We have legislation in Massachusetts that calls for essentially an 85% reduction in emissions from 1990 levels by 2050, and some interim targets that are very aggressive. And the only way to meet those goals will be through renewable energy and decreasing our reliance on fossil fuels. We're at the end of the oil and natural gas pipelines that come into the area. So we don't have a lot of our indigenous resources, such as oil and natural gas within the region itself. It's all brought into the area by interstate pipelines. And it's a densely populated area, so you don't see as much opportunity for generation in the long run. There is quite a bit of solar that's being installed in Massachusetts. There are very aggressive programs, regulatory incentives for solar development that have been actively the subject of investment in this area and have decreased peak loads to some extent. And as we go out over time, offshore wind is a big issue in New England. There are areas that are subject to federal leasing by the Bureau of Energy Management under the Biden administration. The first offshore commercial scale wind project was recently approved off the coast of Cape Cod in Martha's Vineyard to deliver 800 megawatts into the New England area. There are legislative goals in Massachusetts and other states that could bring that 800 megawatt level up to 5,000 or 10,000 megawatts over the next 10 or 15 years, where offshore wind will be a major component of the energy mix in New England. In addition, energy efficiency is very much the focus of increased attention to ensure that investor-owned utilities in Massachusetts and New England are aggressively implementing energy efficiency, offering programs to their customers to ensure that their energy consumption is minimized throughout the year, but particularly at times of peak, and then investments are made to make those facilities, those homes, those businesses as efficient as possible. And I mentioned transmission. Again, for all of these resources, it's necessary to interconnect them to the electric grid, be it solar, be it offshore wind, be it power from Canada. And the transmission companies in New England have a tall task ahead of them in permitting and licensing transmission facilities and building and making the investments to make those types of facilities a reality. So quite a bit going on in the area. Climate change, I alluded to that at the outset. That's a driver of many of these underlying government policies. We've seen quite aberrant weather in New England, as I know you have in the Southwest. Kevin, you mentioned that. And that is greatly influencing the shape and the speed with which policy changes are being proposed in Massachusetts and New England to make sure that the grid is as reliable as possible, that we decrease our reliance on fossil fuel, that we retard the increase in sea level rise that may affect coastal communities. And I'm interested how all of that is playing out in your individual jurisdictions, and whether, for instance, the model of ERCOT is something that's going to be revisited so as to make Texas part of a more regional electric grid and subject itself to FERC jurisdiction, which hasn't been the case in the past.
Hey, David, I was going to ask, one of the things that that our commission and our state is really focused on is battery storage technology. Certainly on a large scale basis, but we also have a lot of pilot programs at the residential scale. Obviously, we have a lot of land out here. We don't notice when it gets to be 118 degrees since we're used to it, other than to look at the calendar and say, oh, it's early June instead of early July that we're hitting those numbers. So yeah, we certainly are hitting heat waves, but battery storage seems to be a way to at least allow more localized control of the grid. And again, there seems to be, Arizona and California, the relationship between the two states, certainly on issues of water, issues of electricity. Arizona always feels that from the federal level, we're the younger brother or the younger sibling to California. So there is sort of a tendency for our politicians to not want to think about interconnecting or having a California-driven transmission organization telling Arizona when and where it can use its power. So I think that that's going to be one of the large hurdles here in the Southwest. But again, battery storage has been a big deal here, and I'm just wondering how it is over on the East.
Yeah, it is a big issue, and we're seeing more of those being proposed by the transmission and distribution companies to backstop their system and address contingencies. There's great improvements in the technology in terms of their ability to store energy for prolonged periods of time. Used to be that they could only do for an hour or two, but some of the newer technologies have greater capability to provide storage capability for several hours that might address a contingency on the transmission or distribution system. And also some developers are looking at large-scale battery facilities on the order of several hundred megawatts that they would invest in to participate in the competitive market. ISO New England offers capacity payments if you're able to provide that type of capacity in a firm commitment for storage facilities. And some of the states are looking at what they call clean peak programs, where if those facilities make themselves available and reserve their capacity for peak hours, they're given an incentive to be on reserve with capacity. By essentially, the way storage works is you sort of consume electricity and put into the storage unit from an off-peak period when it's cheap to consume that electricity. You store it, you retain it, and then you dispatch it at a time when it's most needed or when the market would most value that electricity. So storage is a key component of the climate change initiatives and some of the policy initiatives to bring renewable power into the area and to decrease the reliance on fossil fuel. I'd be interested in whether you're seeing that in Texas as well, Kevin.
Problems with distribution during the weather earlier this year, and now as the heat is building here in Texas, has really highlighted the need to diversify. And we have gone increasingly to renewables. A lot of wind energy installations in the recent years, some very large wind energy projects going in along the Texas Gulf Coast, as well as solar projects along the coast. It's become a political football with the proponents of natural gas saying that the problem is going to be caused by renewables, to properly design hydrocarbon projects or design them for transition to renewables. So we're having a bit of a moment right now in Texas in making the realization of which way we're going to go and how to build. I know that a lot of the larger projects that are ongoing in Texas currently have a large storage component associated with them. And there are a lot of battery manufacturers and storage technology companies that are moving into Texas with the idea of exploring that market. But I expect to see primarily battery storage projects building increasingly as you have to deal with periods of peak demand. As in Arizona, you know, if you're going to go from 118 degrees during the summer to periods of freezing and snow and interruption during the winter, you have to have a lot of elasticity in your system so that you can pick up periods of peak demand without interruptions.
And our, you know, I will say our local utilities have done a good job with that. I mean, the last curtailment was based on that large power outage that occurred, I believe, in August of last year. But other than that, I mean, one of the things again that's touted here is as a state that has vertically integrated utilities, we don't have retail choice yet, but certainly, so one of the things they tout is reliability and the idea of interconnecting to a larger group and giving up some type of control, at least scheduling control, is going to be a large hurdle here in Arizona over the next few years, I think.
I think we're experiencing that same thing in reverse. Realizing that we need to have flexibility to access other markets more readily. The local consumer choice has a not a dark side, but has its weaknesses.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, we have one commissioner that always points to Texas in terms of a model for retail choice, and sometimes that works in his favor, and sometimes it doesn't.
I'd love to get your input on the shift from the Trump administration to the Biden administration and what you see that as being a driver in your jurisdictions or for your clients. I know, as I look at what's happened in the first 6 months of the Biden administration, we've seen, as I mentioned, offshore wind get some focus. There's an infrastructure bill pending where there's going to be quite a bit of investment on system stability, system integrity, investing in, reliability, not only on roads and bridges, but in the electric system as well. The Biden administration, and one of the first initiatives was to cancel the Keystone pipeline. That was going to be a large fuel pipeline brought in from north to south into the southwest and Midwest area. So wondering what you see from the Biden administration as a harbinger of things to come as it affects your clients and your practices.
I'll start here. I think that Texas is sort of it's a destroyer headed in one direction. It doesn't change directions very well. And there's a lot of perception around the change in priorities in the Biden administration. But other than seeing an increased awareness of renewable projects and an increase in good governance in some of our oil companies that are located in Texas, pushing them towards a more renewables mix, I'm not sure I've seen the huge shift that seems to filter into the public perception of the difference between the Trump and the Biden administration, at least in our state. The pipeline infrastructure that was ongoing beforehand will continue. I think we're going to see some significant improvements in our grid and transmission infrastructure. That was going to be driven by local politics as much as by federal priorities. And I'll say, for the Keystone pipeline, it got a lot of press nationally, but it was always, from a Texas perspective, a very mixed bag in that it was going to be bringing a lot of crude, of low quality crude, into refineries that were already awash with it. So that was going to be volume that would be competing with Texas volumes. And so it was a bit of a mixed bag for us. You heard a lot of pushback on it. I'm not sure the actual industry reaction to it would match the public perception.
Well, here in Arizona, we're still counting ballots. So, in terms of the effect between the Trump administration, I think that so again, as I mentioned, our Public Utilities Commission, they are 5 statewide elected officials, and there are currently 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats. But I think that you could argue that our commission is progressive in terms of climate change, in terms of electric vehicles, infrastructure, and carbon emissions. So I believe that they have they are pursuing a path that is more consistent with what you see from the Biden administration in terms of the development of renewables and the requirements and mandates for distributed energy, energy efficiency. A lot of this stuff, though, comes at a cost. And our Republican-controlled House and Senate, again, as I had mentioned, they may believe that, well, wait a second, we're the ones that have been elected to determine what energy policy should be in Arizona. And again, I just kind of see a potential of a legal fight over who has that jurisdiction, because the House and the Senate here, again, they lean to the right. While they're not counting any ballots, they will have time to focus on limiting the cost of these new programs, so that Arizona ratepayers are not, at least are not unduly saddled with the cost of switching our generation portfolio over to 100% carbon-free emissions. So, but again, I think our utilities, our investor-owned utilities, our public utility, and our utilities commission is going to try and take advantage of the infrastructure deals that under the Biden administration has to incent developers of those types of energies.
Yeah, and Patrick, you did mention electrification and electric vehicles, and I was remiss for not mentioning that earlier. Some of the policy initiatives and statutory enactments that have been developed over the last year or so in New England, particularly Massachusetts, call for all new vehicles in the next 10 to 15 years to be, not gasoline based, to be electric. That's going to require lots of infrastructure to allow for electric charging facilities throughout the roads and byways of the states in New England, because not all the vehicles can be charged in people's homes overnight. There's going to be, long travel that requires interim recharging of vehicles. That in and of itself will impose greater electrical demands on the system. While it reduces emissions for sure, the electric system itself has to account for that type of load that will be new and different from what it's seen in the past, contributing in that manner to a low emission, zero carbon type of overall energy mix. So it'll affect both the transportation industry as well as the energy industry in this area. And it'll be interesting to see whether, car manufacturers are going to be able to transition their fleets soon enough with the volumes that will be necessary to move to electric vehicles as the staple of the types of cars they manufacture over the next 10 to 15 years. I don't know what you folks have in terms of your view on electrification with electric vehicles.
Being in Texas, I think we've made the siting of the Tesla Gigafactory here in Austin that's going to be making electric trucks, and Ford's announcement that it'll be making electric trucks. You got to make those before Texans are going to drive them. And so I think people are trying to drive into that market sector, and it's going to be a difficult adoption here in Texas because of the long distances many people drive. We're going to have extension of infrastructure so that if you regularly make a trip between Austin and Midland, you're going to have to charge somewhere in between just to complete the drive. And a lot of people do those kinds of drives on a very regular basis. So there's a great deal of interest in infrastructure projects along the major thoroughfares and interstates in Texas to facilitate travel. It's going to be a challenge to keep up with the amount of electrification that's going to be going on in the next 10 years.
Yeah, Kevin, we have the same issue over here in Arizona. There's a lot of travel between California and Arizona or Nevada. I mean, you can drive for 2.5 hours and not see a gas station. So the idea of longer term distances will be a challenge. Our state and policies are to certainly to focus on the urban areas, but not to forget the rural areas and the fact that in order to make electrification and electric vehicles work, they have to have an ability to drive distances or to have the infrastructure in place so that they can make those longer trips. There's a lot of incentives that are being provided by our local utilities for fleet management. Large companies that have fleets that will convert them over to electricity. There are certain incentives in place to get those done. As of right now, there's no requirements, at least at the state level, to make everybody be driving in an electric vehicle by 2030 or 2035. Just monetary incentives.
Yeah, Kevin and Patrick, I've enjoyed talking to you. And what's interesting to me is while there's different geography, political makeup, climate conditions in your states as compared to the Northeast, it's interesting to me that you guys are facing the same issues that we're facing here, albeit in somewhat different emphasis and different context. But the trends on the energy industry are going to require some nimble actions by the industry participants, lots of interesting issues for lawyers and their clients to resolve. And I think we're going to be seeing pretty much an uptick in business over the ensuing decade to work through these very difficult issues. Any closing comments from you, Kevin or Patrick? I'd be interested in hearing.
Just in closing, David, I do agree with you. The technological boom is not done. I can see a day where they put in the last electric vehicle charging station and come up with fuel cells so that you don't actually need the electric infrastructure. Similar to what we've seen here with the price of solar. The Abengoa plant that APS customers pay close to 25 cents a kilowatt hour for that plant originally. Now solar is under 3 cents a kilowatt hour. It's amazing what 10, 15 years can do in terms of technology. And then, of course, there's a lot of innovation being done at the residential level. The ability for climate control, the ability to load shape. So hopefully, here's my phone. I never had a phone like this 20 years ago. You watch movies, it's funny. People are still using flip phones. So imagine if we look at the technology increase in telecommunications, I think we're going to see a lot of new ideas and new products for consumers in the next 10 to 20 years.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. When I started practicing in the energy business, I was a geologist and was in oil and gas exploration, and we were approaching in the early 1980s peak production. We were running out of reserves. There was going to be no oil and gas left in the world, and the end was in sight. And the next thing you know, some new technology that allowed us to fracture stimulate wells and to increase production and to steer wells into new formations where oil and gas couldn't be produced before, resulted in a huge expansion in oil and gas production, a huge worldwide expansion in reserves. And now we're going to see the same. It was a transition in technology that allowed that to happen. And the interesting thing about being in the energy business is we're now seeing another major turn where technology is going to drive us to new types of generation that are more environmentally and ecologically sound, probably less expensive, more diverse, and more functional in the long term. And something that, it's going to challenge the technical minds of the young people who are dealing with this today on how to deal with something that it's not really so much a transition of an existing industry as almost the beginning of a new energy infrastructure industry going forward. It's an exciting time to be involved.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Kevin. I really enjoyed hearing your perspectives, and I look forward to sharing notes with you on some of these issues as we go forward. I hope it's been good for you as well.
Thank you for hosting, David. I knew you would do a great job.
And that concludes our recording. Thank you for joining us today. You can find this and many other episodes at scgglobalspin.com.